Thank you for joining me. This is UltraHuman, and my name is Rachel. I am here to help you be your best human with today's 3 studies on why perspective is so influential on our lives and our health and how we shape our reality, really. And I don't want people to think I'm not going to be getting into any law of attraction or anything like that. These are real studies, and I've got the references all down in the description for just how our perspective and the way that we perceive things in our lives really influences in a very measurable way our outcomes. And so if you will join me today, I'm going to be going over those. Again, down in the description are all of the links. And please comment below and let me know what your New Year's resolutions are, and I will join you down in the comments. Thank you. Earlier this year, I read a book. I listened to a book called Suggestible You. A lot of that book is about the power of placebos and what really is a placebo and how does that work and why do people react so strongly to it. It gets into some other interesting things like hypnotism. It's a very, if you want to understand more about just like the whole process of medical science and just your brain, I highly suggest picking up this book. Either you can listen to it on Audible like I did, or you can pick it up at your local bookstore. But Suggestible You is where I became aware of this one story that I thought was really powerful just because of how impactful this shift in mindset was for these people in a very tangible and measurable way. So in 2008 is when the NPR study was posted. I tried to check, it didn't say in that article when the study was conducted, but essentially they were looking at hotel maids. So these were women who got a lot of physical activity in a day. They were hauling vacuum cleaners up and down stairs and vacuuming and folding and, having to climb over beds to tuck the sheets and all these kinds of things. That's a lot of physical activity. However, when these women were interviewed, they asked, how much exercise do you get in a week? And over a third of the women said none. They absolutely believed that they weren't getting any exercise in a week. And the interesting thing is that their bodies reflected that. They had poor hip to waist ratios, they had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, all of the markers for someone who has a very sedentary lifestyle. And yet here were these women with these very active lifestyles. So what they did is they split this group of 84 women in 2. And with one of them, they just followed, they came back to take all their measurements without following up in any way. With the other group, they actually talked to these women and they sat them down. They said, these are the Surgeon General recommendations for daily activity. This is what you're doing every day. And so according to the Surgeon General, you are getting more than enough physical activity. You're actually doing more than the minimum required amount of exercise to be considered a healthy person. And what was amazing is they came back a month later and retook all these measurements and found a 10% drop in blood pressure, just dramatic results in all of these different categories. The most interesting is that they were already exercising. It's not like they didn't incorporate anything new into their life, but they didn't have the benefits of this exercise. It's not just that like their mood improved because they realized that, oh, I actually am exercising. It's like they really were exercising and they were really not getting the results. So it's not even that they ended up with the positive results in the end. What's almost more fascinating to me is that it was them telling themselves in the first place that they weren't people who exercise. It was that self-perception of, I am not someone who gets enough exercise, that was stopping them in the first place from getting the benefits of the physical activity that they were already doing. So that's kind of the point of this video, is that now that we're going into the new year, I really just want to help everyone as we're kind of, starting over and coming up with New Year's resolutions, to refocus ourselves in such a way where we can see those barriers. So like for these women, that barrier was that they didn't perceive themselves as people who were taking care of their health. And once they started to see themselves as, wow, these things I'm doing are really for myself. Like when I vacuum this floor, it's benefiting me positively because I'm getting that exercise in, I'm getting that motion in my day, and I'm going to see the benefits from it. And that just that little shift can have such a huge effect on our lives. So in the same way, the next reference was from a different NPR podcast. Actually, the next two are both from the podcast Hidden Brain from NPR. And they did a U 2.0 series, and one of the episodes is called Dream Jobs. So in that episode, they interview a woman who talks a lot about job crafting. And what that is you have your occupation, but then there's the on-paper duties of that occupation, and then there's what you actually end up doing in the day-to-day role of that job, the janitorial staff. So you have these mostly women, again, who they have a specific job description, right? That's like when you're hired and you get like your job description, you know, they're there to dust and mop and sweep and clean up maybe after someone checks out of a room and those kinds of things. That's just like the bare minimum, you would say, that the bare minimum of their job description. But then what they did is they interviewed the women and asked them to describe their jobs. They adhered to the bare minimum requirements of their job. The more they just didn't enjoy it. They had overall dissatisfaction really with their lives because they spend any of us that go to work, we spend a lot of our life on the job. And so these people had very low satisfaction. They were very grumbly and just discontent. So on the flip side of that, the people who said that they had a very, very high amount of satisfaction with their job often were quite off the script when it came to how they described what they did and what their work looked like. One person went as far as when they asked, like, what's your job title? She, instead of saying, like, I am part of the janitorial staff of this hospital, she said, I am a healer. So some of these things that people saw themselves as might get somebody fired, really, because they're going so far above and beyond. Now, they're not doing things that are like dangerous, but they would do things, the people who had very high job satisfaction in this particular case, they were doing things like, instead of just, going into the room and mopping and sweeping and just doing the basics, they would do things like check the ceiling because they understand that people are laying down in their beds. And so they're going to be looking up at the ceiling. And if there's cobwebs or stains or something, that might really bother them. So they would check the ceilings and sweep around there and, check that, keep tabs on how often people had visitors and maybe come back around if somebody was having a bad day and spend some time talking to them. Just like those interpersonal things and those little above and beyond thoughtful things that were really bringing them personally a much higher level of satisfaction. And I know you probably have all had the experience of there's that person in a workplace who, like, if you just looked at their job title and you just looked at their job description that they were hired for, that in no way measures the impact that that person has on a workplace. And those kinds of people not only have a positive effect on everyone around them, but they have so much greater personal satisfaction with their work because they're deriving meaning from it. And they're finding that. It didn't get thrusted upon them. They have to actually find it and put it there. So that's really what job crafting is. And that's what this podcast, if you want to go back and listen to it, I will have the links for all of these things in the description below, and I totally encourage everyone to seek these things out and look at it more, because there is a real science to the idea that the way that we perceive ourselves and the way that we perceive our lives has such a huge impact on our attitudes and just our actual outcomes. This was kind of accumulated conclusion that I came to while listening to these various resources, was just when you see yourself as being on that path where you are growing, you are much more likely to take the next step and take the next action and employ that next habit that is really going to help you become that person that you want to be. So all of these are just little things that I hope can help us all get there. So the last one is, again, this was a reference from the Hidden Brain series, podcast from NPR. It was called, it was a radio replay called Yum and Yuck, and it's about what makes us like foods and what makes us dislike foods, or what even is disgust versus liking in terms of our psychology and culture around food. So Paul Rosen is a gentleman who works for the University of Philadelphia. He has 40 years of experience in researching food and culture and psychology around food. And they talk about several things. They talk about, like, how do we get to a weird place, like enjoying to eat spicy things? Like, that's a kind of a strange thing, because there's no inherent reason that we would like spicy things. Children don't like spicy things. Most animals don't like spicy things. So why is it that people go from not liking spicy things as children, and then depending on the culture that we grow up in, we really like them later on in life? And that just kind of speaks to something that I think is interesting, is just like looking at our own cultural conditioning. Where did we come from, and what are the things that, like, inherently we have, you know, we weren't born with these things, like maybe a habit or just like a way that we accept the world around us, that we really had to learn. And how many of these things are benefiting us, and how much of it can we unlearn, is just kind of a general thing to take from that. But what I thought was really interesting, and what I thought applied sort of more to this episode, was that he talks about the French diet. And I don't know what you know about the French diet, but I'm fascinated by it because it's very, very high in saturated fats. They have a lot of, not a lot probably compared to an American diet, but if you just looked at what they ate, like, they don't necessarily shy away from sweets, sweet treat type things, or really fatty foods, things that we in America would look at and objectively be like, that's not good for you. But interestingly, when you look at the French people as a whole versus Americans as a whole, the French are much, much healthier. Now, I think that there's a lot of nuanced reasons for this, but one of the very important reasons is that they eat their food in a very different way. And a lot of this, I think, is based on their perspective of food. In America, we have reinforced this idea that food is fuel, and it's actually for the sake of losing weight, and that way that we think about food, where we look at it as a utility tool, a means to an ends. We are hungry, we need to be full, we need energy, so we eat this food, and it goes inside of our bodies, and it does a job, and then it evacuates. So this perspective on food kind of leads to actually, I would say, overeating. We eat a lot of junk foods because, we need to eat because it's mealtime, and we have that ghrelin spike that's causing us to feel hungry. So we eat something fast on the run because we have very busy lives in America. We don't have a lot of downtime. And so we end up overeating poor foods, and in the process of that, we also don't enjoy the food. So we're eating probably more calories and larger portion sizes, and we're getting less joy out of that time with our food. And the flip side of that is the way that the French approach a mealtime is that this is a time to slow down, usually to socialize, and really enjoy the entire process of eating. So not only the flavors and the textures, but just that whole process of like the sitting down, the winding down, the conversation, and then, yeah, the textures and the flavors and the smells and just the entire experience and taking it all in and taking the time to do that. And as a result of this, they eat much less. You may know that it takes your body a certain amount of time to recognize some of the physical and hormonal markers that you are satisfied, that you're full. So when we eat really fast, such as, say you have a 30-minute lunch here in America, and so you swing through a drive-through and you're really hungry because you pecked on some food this morning that raised up your insulin because you had that breakfast bar and then you haven't eaten and it's been several hours, and so now you're really hungry, and so you have a Big Mac and a soda, which will never make you feel full. But you consume this stuff really fast, and then you get back from lunch, and then it's not for like another 30 minutes to an hour, and suddenly you just feel exhausted because all of your body's resources are now going to digesting this massive calorie and sugar load that you just put into your body, and it's only just now that you're starting to recognize that you're really full. So if you had taken the time to sit down with a handful of almonds and some salt and some other fatty food to go with that, and you had chewed all those things up slowly and completely while having a conversation with a friend for that half hour, instead, you would probably have felt just as full. You would probably not feel as lethargic and as sluggish, and you wouldn't have the same kind of brain clouding and fogging. So you can kind of just see the dichotomy there. Now, obviously, in France, I would imagine that a half-hour lunch would be like unheard of. I'm sure that they have an hour or more to take lunch so that they can actually walk down to a cafe and sit down and sip the coffee and all those kinds of things. But if you can, sort of like the job crafting thing, if you can build those things into your life somehow, even if it's not every meal, even if it's just like we've talked a lot here about intermittent fasting, maybe that's your first meal of the day, so you pack your meal because this is when you're breaking your fast. You haven't had breakfast, you skipped that altogether, so you had more time in your morning to pack a healthy lunch. And now here you are at lunch, and you're going to sit down at a table and you're going to enjoy the meal that you prepared yourself. And this is a meal that you're going to enjoy. It's not just fuel, and you're going to eat each bite and really have that entire experience. I pretty much guarantee you, because I know when I've done this myself and I'm not eating standing up in the kitchen because I have children running around all of my legs, that when you take that time and you really sit down and you enjoy the meal, you feel much more full, you feel much more satisfied, and you literally just feel happier about the entire experience. And I think there's very much something to be said about the fact that humans are social creatures. We live in packs and family units, and I think that we have been sitting down to meals with our families forever, for as long as we've been social creatures evolving on this amazing planet. I think that we have been sitting down as families and communities over food and enjoying one another and our company, and I guess that's a beautiful place to leave this video off. And I hope that everyone has a safe and happy new year, and may you all get together with your friends and family over a meal and discuss how you are going to attack this new year so you can get out there and be your best human. Thank you for joining me. Take care.